the big national stories around today. Interest rates, they have been cut. The National Australia Bank, Commonwealth Bank, they're going to pass the whole thing on. But amazingly, the ANZ Bank and Westpac, who on the same day as a data breach was known about them, they're not going to pass the whole thing on. Here's the Treasurer waving the finger at, in particular, banks like the ANZ who won't pass the 0.25% on, which is about $70 a payment for those that are on the average payment back of a mortgage.
Well, I think the ANZ has let down its customers. This is deeply disappointing from the ANZ. We heard from Commissioner Hayne just months ago that the banks were putting profits before people. Actions like this don't give the Australian people any comfort that the banks have changed their behaviour.
Now, there's two things here, and we talked about this a little bit. I mean, talk about politics changing. 15 years ago in the 2004 election, keep interest rates low was on the lectern for John Howard every single speech during that campaign. They are now profoundly lower than that, but government doesn't want to own these particular low interest rates for a myriad of different reasons. Also, it's read a little differently than that was 15 years ago. But what do you think about politicians waving at private companies to pass it on? It's sort of in their interest to do it for PR, but...
Well, haven't we seen this movie before? Didn't we get this through the Banking Royal Commission? Because the big four banks haven't got a competitive market environment to keep them honest. And it seems that only when you've got a Royal Commission functioning that they do half the right thing. So I think they need further scrutiny. I said at the time they should have a special counsel with Royal Commission powers to have ongoing scrutiny of the banks and make sure that in the absence of market competition they're responsive to common sense and the public interest in a way that you just don't see. But the thing about interest rates is quite remarkable because you've now got the central bank, the Australian Reserve Bank, that's trying to get higher inflation. You see, the inflation band's 2 to 3. They're trying to stimulate economic growth to get higher inflation. So it's a circumstance the like of which we probably haven't seen in the modern Australian economy. So that's unusual in itself, and the banks, again, doing the wrong thing. I was
listening to an economist from KPMG on telly a bit earlier in the day saying their hope was that it would be 50 basis points and you go hard, you go early, rather than a little bit. The Reserve Bank Governor's making a speech tonight suggesting there's a little more to come. What's your sense about whether this is the way to do it, ever so slowly, or you go for the big whack hoping that that sends the shockwave that's needed?
Oh, I think any cut after this long period of stable interest rate settings is going to have an impact out there in the market, but there's only so much you can do. You know, money becomes so cheap that it's not providing the stimulus that would come from a rate cut from a higher level. So, you know, the Reserve Bank's also been talking about government spending more. I'm not too sure that's the solution. I think most of these avenues lead back to the sluggish wages growth that we've got in Australia, because if wages were higher and companies were more profitable to pay higher wages, you'd have stronger investment, stronger consumer spending, and that's the stimulus we've been sorely lacking over the last 4 or 5 years.
I just have to ask, are you surprised that the politics is so much different? 15 years ago, it's on the lectern every single day, and now they don't want to own, well, it's lower than ever before, and that means we're great.
Well, it is good news for home buyers and people wanting to get into the market. There's nothing that beats low interest rates. I remember as part of the ABC leftist bias, Laura Tingle was arguing that low interest rates would be bad for the Morrison government. Oh, it's a terrible sign of economic mismanagement. The truth is lower interest rates are always fairly popular out there.
Correct.
And maybe they're not owning it because there's a bit of election fatigue. It's not a time for scoring points, is it? Although he's hopped into the banks in an appropriate way, the Treasurer. So I think it's more that we're just out of a long election season rather than governments thinking that low interest rates are bad news.
And by the way, I've got the tattoo. I voted for Latham then and I voted for Latham now.
We've got to get you the T-shirt.
Yeah, I remember, triple extra large. Troy, look, politicians, as Mark says, we've seen this movie before, private companies do something. Can you think of something more idiotic for a bank like ANZ not to get involved and just say, look, we've just come out of not even a near-death experience. It was all billed as a near-death experience of the Royal Commission. Look, I get it, they all want to make their profit, but for goodness sake, just pass it on, right?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the credibility of the banks was completely shredded with the Royal Commission, and you think they'd be doing everything they can to try to get customers back on side and to rebuild their reputation. And so two of the big banks out of the four have done that today. The other two are lagging well behind. I saw the interest rate decision as obviously good for people who have mortgages and good for consumers. There's no doubt about that, and it's good that politically the Treasurer is on the side of those folk and demanding that the banks take action and pass it on. But it is a worrying sign about the state of the economy. So there'd be no doubt the government would be concerned about this because, as Mark said, the Reserve Bank's taken this action to try to stimulate the economy. And the Reserve Bank's made a couple of other observations today. One is that they're worried about low wages growth, and they're also worried about falling house prices. So, you know, there's some people suggesting that maybe this wasn't a great election for the government to win. I don't buy into that argument, but there are some storm clouds on the horizon, and so there's some good and bad news for the government in this announcement.
You don't employ Tingle logic. It doesn't lead.
No, I'm not at all.
It doesn't.
Not at all. I'm just noting it. It's a view that's out there.